What happens when a man who has everything is about to lose the one thing he can't buy? Julian Vance, a titan of industry, forged in steel and audacity, believed his pregnant wife was just another beautiful asset in his gilded cage. When she finally found the courage to leave, he laughed. He saw her tears as a temporary storm, a hormonal tantrum he could weather with a checkbook and a dismissive smile. He watched from his penthouse window as she walked out of his life, a lonely figure on the rain-slicked pavement. But his laughter caught in his throat, turning to ice in his veins when a car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a taxi. It wasn't a friend. The door opened, and the person who stepped out to greet her was the one ghost from his past Julian prayed he would never see again. The laughter echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, a sound as sharp and cold as the city skyline it surveyed. Julian Vance, a man whose net worth was discussed in financial journals with a mixture of awe and terror, threw his head back and laughed again. The sound was without humor, a percussive assertion of power. Across the vast, minimalist living room, Isabella stood, with a small, hastily packed leather duffel bag at her feet. Her hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of her stomach, a 6-month testament to a love that had long since curdled into an obligation. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot, each one a tiny rebellion against the man she had once adored. "You're leaving me," Julian finally managed, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. He gestured around the room, a sweeping motion that encompassed the original Rothko on the wall, the custom Fazioli grand piano in the corner, and the breathtaking view of Central Park below. "You're leaving this for what?" A sudden fit of feminine hysteria, Isabella flinched, but her voice, when it came, was steadier than she felt. "I'm leaving you, Julian. I'm leaving this mausoleum. I can't bring a child into this world. Not this one." "This world," he scoffed, striding towards her. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than the car her father drove. He stopped just short of her, close enough that she could smell the expensive peaty aroma of his scotch. "I've given you the world, Isabella. Don't be foolish. You're pregnant. Your hormones are making you irrational." He reached out to touch her belly, a proprietary gesture she had come to despise. He didn't see a baby, a life they had created. He saw an heir, a continuation of the Vance dynasty, another asset. She slapped his hand away. The sound was shockingly loud in the cavernous room. Julian's smile tightened, the humor vanishing, completely replaced by a glacial fury. "Don't you dare," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice cracking but resolute. "I'm not a vase you put on display. I'm not a broodmare for your legacy. I'm a person. And this baby deserves a father who sees them as a person, not a stock portfolio." "And where will you go?" he sneered, his confidence returning. "Back to your little walk-up in Brooklyn, with your artist friends who think success is selling a painting for enough to cover their rent. How long do you think you'll last, my dear, before you come crawling back a week, too?" He truly believed it. He had plucked her from obscurity, a talented but unknown art curator, and placed her in a world of unimaginable wealth. He had paid off her family's mortgage, funded her brother's education, and draped her in diamonds. In his mind, he hadn't just married her, he had acquired her. Gratitude, he believed, should be her only language. "That's the difference between you and me, Julian," she said, picking up her bag. "You think everything has a price. You think my dignity, my happiness, my child's future, it's all for sale. But it's not." She walked towards the private elevator that opened directly into their apartment. Her steps were heavy, each one a final painful severance. Julian didn't move. He simply watched her, a smug, unbothered expression on his face. He'd play this game. Let her have her little drama. She'd be back by the weekend, apologetic, and ready to be the docile, beautiful wife he required. He poured himself another scotch, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. This was just a minor inconvenience, a brief theatrical intermission in the grand play of his life. He raised his glass in a mock toast as the polished steel doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing her out. "Goodbye, my little bird," he murmured to the empty room. "Enjoy your brief flight." He chuckled to himself, took a long sip of his drink, and walked over to the window, intrigued to see the pathetic next chapter of her little rebellion unfold. He expected to see her fumbling for a taxi on the street below, a sad, defeated figure, swallowed by the immensity of the city she was so ill-equipped to handle on her own. The show, he thought, was about to get truly pathetic, and he had a front-row seat. Julian stood by the window, a king surveying his kingdom from on high. The height usually gave him a sense of omnipotence, but tonight it was merely a vantage point for a private, cruel comedy. He watched the main entrance of the building, a grand portico of marble and brass, waiting for Isabella to emerge. The rain had started to fall harder, slicking the asphalt of Fifth Avenue until it gleamed like black obsidian under the streetlights. A perfect setting, he thought, with a smirk. The pathetic fallacy in action. A weeping sky for his weeping, foolish wife. Finally, the doorman, in his crisp, military-style uniform, pushed open the heavy glass door. Isabella stepped out, clutching her thin coat around herself. She looked small and vulnerable from this distance, just as he'd imagined. She hesitated on the top step, looking left and right, the duffel bag seeming to weigh her down. Julian swirled his scotch, the ice clinking softly. Here it comes, he thought. The fumbling for her phone, the desperate search for a taxi in the downpour, the slow, dawning realization of her utter aloneness. He leaned forward slightly, savoring the moment. But there was no fumbling. Isabella simply stood there waiting. And then it happened. A car turned the corner and pulled silently to a stop directly in front of the portico. Julian's eyebrows lifted. It wasn't a yellow cab. It wasn't an Uber Prius. It was a car that belonged on this street in front of this building. A deep, midnight blue vehicle, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the city lights in distorted liquid streaks. Julian squinted. Even from this height, the lines were unmistakable. The iconic grille, the commanding presence, the spirit of ecstasy ornament leading the charge. It was a Rolls-Royce. Not just any Rolls-Royce. It was a Cullinan, the brand's monument to opulent all-terrain power. An SUV that cost more than most people's houses, a fortress of wealth on wheels. A flicker of annoyance pierced Julian's amusement. Had one of her vapid socialite friends come to her rescue? Had she managed to retain some sliver of the life he'd given her? The doorman, who bowed to no one but the building's billionaire residents, rushed forward to open the rear passenger door before the driver could even step out. He held a large black umbrella aloft, shielding the emerging passenger from the rain. Julian leaned closer to the glass, his drink forgotten in his hand. Who was this? It wasn't a woman. A man stepped out of the Cullinan. He was older, perhaps, in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair that seemed to defy the rain. He wore a beautifully tailored charcoal overcoat, and even from dozens of stories up, he moved with an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He didn't rush. He simply turned, and extended a hand towards Isabella. Isabella, who had been standing so rigidly, seemed to melt. She took the man's hand, a genuine, radiant smile breaking through her tear-stained face. A smile Julian hadn't seen, directed at him in years. The man said something, and she nodded, her entire posture changing from one of desperate escape to one of profound relief and safety. He gently took her duffel bag with his other hand and guided her into the warm, waiting interior of the Rolls-Royce. Julian's heart began to hammer against his ribs. There was something familiar about the man's profile, the set of his shoulders. A cold, dread alien and unwelcome began to snake its way up his spine. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The man closed the door after Isabella gave a curt, dismissive nod to the doorman, and then walked around to the other side of the car. But before getting in, he stopped. He tilted his head back, his gaze sweeping upwards past the floors of granite and glass, directly towards the penthouse window, directly towards Julian. The distance was immense. The rain was blurring the world, but there was no mistaking him. The city lights illuminated his face for a single, damning moment. The sharp jawline, now softened by age, but still resolute. The intelligent, piercing eyes that had once looked at Julian with pride and then with bitter disappointment. The laughter died in Julian Vance's throat. The glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor and splashing scotch across his immaculate shoes. He stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was Arthur Penhaligon, his mentor, his partner, the man he had ruthlessly betrayed and financially destroyed a decade ago to seize control of their shared company. The man who had vanished, broken and humiliated, presumed to be living out his days in obscurity and poverty. Arthur Penhaligon, looking not broken, but powerful, wealthy. And he was driving away with Julian's pregnant wife. The smugness, the arrogance, the unshakable confidence, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, primal terror. This wasn't a hormonal whim. This wasn't a marital spat. This was a declaration of war. A war Julian had thought he'd already won 10 years ago. And the ghost he had created had just stolen his future. The shattered glass crunched under Julian's shoe as he staggered backward, his mind a maelstrom of denial and fury. Arthur. It couldn't be Arthur. Arthur was a footnote in his biography, a cautionary tale he sometimes told younger, ambitious executives about the weakness of sentimentality in business. He was supposed to be a ghost, a relic of a past Julian had buried under a mountain of profit and power. He lurched toward his desk and slammed a button on his intercom. "Marcus, get in here now." His voice was a raw bark stripped of its usual controlled authority. Marcus Thorne, his COO, and the closest thing Julian had to a friend, rushed in. Moments later, his face a mask of concern. "Julian, what happened? I heard a crash." "He was here," Julian breathed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disheveling it for the first time in years. "Penhaligon, he was here." Marcus frowned, confused. "Arthur Penhaligon, here in the building." "Outside," Julian roared, pointing a trembling finger at the window. "He just drove off with Isabella. In a Cullinan, Marcus, a goddamn Rolls-Royce Cullinan." Marcus's professional calm finally fractured. "What? That's impossible. The last I heard, Arthur was living in a rented cottage in the Cotswolds, barely solvent." "That's what he wanted us to think," Julian snarled, his mind racing, connecting dots that were a decade old. The betrayal, sharp and vivid as if it were yesterday, flooded his memory. Flashback. 10 years earlier, the firm was called Vance and Penhaligon Properties. Arthur, then a titan of London real estate in his late 50s, had taken a raw, ferociously ambitious Julian Vance under his wing. Julian was brilliant, hungry, and utterly ruthless qualities Arthur mistook for simple drive. Arthur was the visionary, the man with the reputation, the handshake that was as good as a contract. Julian was the numbers man, the strategist who could squeeze profit from a stone. Their masterpiece was to be the waterfront Elysium, a groundbreaking mixed-use development on a derelict stretch of the Thames. It was Arthur's dream project, years in the making. He had cultivated the relationships, secured the preliminary council approvals, and sketched the vision. Julian was tasked with structuring the financing. The linchpin was a consortium of Japanese investors, old-world traditionalists, who trusted Arthur implicitly. Arthur brought Julian into the inner circle, presenting him as his protégé, his successor. "Julian has a mind like a steel trap," Arthur would say, clapping him on the back. "He's the future of this company." Julian smiled and absorbed it all. He learned Arthur's methods, his contacts, his vulnerabilities, and his greatest vulnerability was his trust. The deal was on the verge of closing. The Japanese investors were flying in for a final signing. A week before they were due to arrive, Julian made his move. He had spent months secretly creating a separate shell corporation. Using a series of complex but legal maneuvers, he subtly altered the final financing documents, creating clauses and conditions he knew Arthur, with his big-picture focus, wouldn't scrutinize. These clauses made key loan guarantees contingent not on the company Vance and Penhaligon, but on Arthur's personal assets. Simultaneously, he flew to Tokyo on a preparatory visit. He met with the younger, more aggressive members of the consortium's board, the sons of the men who trusted Arthur. He didn't slander Arthur directly. He was more insidious. He sowed seeds of doubt. He spoke of Arthur's old-fashioned methods, his resistance to modern financial instruments, and hinted at potential health issues. He presented himself as the stable, forward-thinking hand needed to truly maximize the project's potential. The day of the signing, Arthur walked in, beaming, ready to realize his dream. The Japanese investors were polite but cool. Their lead negotiator, Mr. Tanaka Jr., pointed to the new clauses. He pointed to a market volatility rider Julian had inserted, which could be triggered at the slightest downturn, placing an immense burden on the personal guarantor. "We cannot proceed with your firm under these terms," Penhaligon's son, Tanaka Jr., said, his voice flat. "It is too much risk for our capital." Arthur was blindsided, confused. He looked to Julian for support, for an explanation. Julian stood up. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing with false confidence, "I understand your concerns, which is why my new firm, Vance Global, is prepared to acquire the project's rights and assume the full financial responsibility, backed by a more robust, diversified funding model." He had spent the last 48 hours securing alternate high-risk, high-interest funding from a hedge fund, using the imminent Japanese deal as leverage. The room fell silent. Arthur stared at Julian, the color draining from his face, as the scale of the treachery became horrifyingly clear. Julian hadn't just structured a deal, he had staged a coup. The Japanese, seeing a way to proceed without the perceived risk of Arthur's old-fashioned ways, agreed. The deal was signed with Vance Global. Arthur was cut out. Worse, the initial groundwork he had laid was tied up in legal knots that Julian's new, more aggressive lawyers used to claim breach of fiduciary duty, launching lawsuits that would systematically drain Arthur's personal fortune in his attempts to fight back. Within 6 months, Vance and Penhaligon was dissolved. Arthur Penhaligon, the man who had built an empire on a handshake, was ruined. He lost his company, his dream project, and his fortune. He sold his home, his art, and his dignity, and then he simply disappeared. Present day. He's been planning this, Julian whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. All this time, he wasn't hiding in poverty. He was regrouping, rebuilding. Marcus looked pale. And Isabella how? Julian's mind flashed to the charity galas, the art auctions. Isabella, with her genuine passion for the arts, often spoke to the older patrons, the quiet connoisseurs. Had Arthur been there hiding in plain sight? A distinguished older gentleman she had struck up a conversation with, one who listened to her, valued her opinion, treated her like a person, and not a possession. The courtship, their marriage, the pregnancy, had Arthur been a silent third party to it all, feeding her doubts, offering a sympathetic ear, slowly, patiently laying the groundwork for his ultimate revenge. The thought was nauseating. It reframed the last several years of his life, not as a triumph, but as a long, elaborate trap. He didn't just take my wife, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. He looked at Marcus, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, renewed purpose. He's come for everything. He thinks he can dismantle my life the way I dismantled his. A cold, hard smile touched Julian's lips. The fear was already crystallizing back into arrogance, into rage. Get our legal team on the phone, the top divorce lawyers. I want her left with nothing, not a single dollar. And get a PI. I want to know everything about Arthur Penhaligon's last 10 years. I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, who he talks to. I buried him once. He walked back to the window, staring down at the city that was his. I'll bury him again. But as he looked down at the rain-swept streets, for the first time in his life, Julian Vance felt the unnerving sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet. The ghost he thought he'd slain was not only real, but it was coming for him, and it had started by stealing the one thing he was only now beginning to realize he couldn't afford to lose. The first volley in Julian's counterattack was an exercise in overwhelming force. Within 24 hours, he had unleashed the furies of his legal department. A team of sharks from the most expensive matrimonial law firm in New York was assembled with a single directive: annihilate. They filed for divorce, citing abandonment and emotional distress. They preemptively filed injunctions to freeze any assets Isabella might try to claim. They drafted discovery requests demanding every text message, email, and phone call she had made for the past 2 years. The message was clear: this would not be an amicable split. It would be a war of attrition designed to bleed her dry emotionally and financially. Simultaneously, the private investigator, a former Mossad agent named Kobe, began his deep dive into Arthur Penhaligon. Julian expected a litany of failures, failed business ventures, mounting debts, a trail of a man struggling to stay afloat. The first report that came back was unnervingly thin. It's like he dropped off the face of the earth for 5 years. Kobe reported, his voice tinged with professional frustration. Then he reappears about 5 years ago, but quietly. No credit, no public records to speak of. He's been living in a leased property in Greenwich, Connecticut. The lease is held by a blind trust registered in Switzerland. A blind trust? Julian scoffed. That's a rich man's game. Where did he get the money? That's the mystery, Kobe admitted. There's no record of any significant income. He attends a few art auctions, always paying with a cashier's check. He's a member of a private intellectual society, mostly old academics and philosophers. On paper, he's a retiree of modest if mysterious means. But a Rolls-Royce Cullinan and a Swiss trust, the paper lies. The lack of information was more infuriating than a sordid history would have been. It meant Arthur was disciplined, careful. It meant he had been preparing for this for a very long time. Then came the second volley, not from Julian, but from Arthur. And it wasn't aimed at Julian's personal life. It was aimed at the heart of his empire. It started with a single, innocuous-looking press release picked up by a niche financial blog. Penhaligon's Strategic Advisors announces new urban renewal initiative. Julian read it and felt a chill. The language was Arthur's, full of vision, community, and sustainable growth. But the teeth were sharp. The firm announced it had secured a massive funding round from a consortium of patient capital investors, family offices, and ethical endowments that prioritized long-term stability over short-term profits. Their first project, the Greenwich Waterfront Revitalization. It was a direct, audacious challenge to Julian's own flagship project, the monolithic Vance Tower, a hyper-luxury skyscraper currently under construction in Stamford, just a few miles away. While Vance Tower was all brutalist glass and steel, promising exclusivity and isolation, Arthur's project promised integrated living green spaces and community hubs. It was a philosophical and commercial attack. "He's competing with me," Julian snarled at Marcus in his office. The stock ticker on his screen showed Vance Global VNC down 2 points. "He's using my own playbook against me." "It's worse than that, Julian," Marcus said, holding up a tablet. "Look at the board of Penhaligon's Strategic Advisors." Julian snatched the tablet. His eyes scanned the names, and his blood ran cold. On the board were two of the most respected architects in the world, a former head of the Environmental Protection Agency and Kenji Tanaka. Not Tanaka Jr., the son he had manipulated, but Tanaka Sr., the patriarch of the Japanese consortium, the old man who had trusted Arthur with his entire being. He was listed as a senior strategic partner. Arthur hadn't just rebuilt, he had reassembled his old world, but this time he had fortified it with the very people whose trust Julian had betrayed. The third volley was the most personal. It came in the form of an exclusive feature in Vanity Fair. Julian expected a sob story from Isabella, a wronged wife narrative, but it was far more devastating. The article, titled "The Curator's Comeback," was a glowing profile of Isabella. It painted her not as a victim, but as a woman who had rediscovered her purpose. There were beautiful photos of her radiant, pregnant, and happy in a sun-drenched art studio. She spoke eloquently about her passion for integrating art into public spaces, about creating environments that fostered connection rather than isolation. She was announced as the new Director of Aesthetic and Community Experience for the Greenwich Waterfront Revitalization Project. Her role wasn't decorative, it was integral to the project's entire ethos. She spoke of Arthur Penhaligon not as a romantic partner, but as a mentor who had reignited her belief in the power of building with integrity. She only mentioned Julian once, and it was a single killer line. When asked about her marriage, she paused, then said, "I lived in a very beautiful, very expensive echo chamber for a long time. I'm just grateful that I can now hear my own voice again." The narrative was set. Arthur was the wise mentor. Isabella was the empowered woman. And Julian, by omission, was the cold, controlling monster who ran the echo chamber. The calls started coming in. Nervous investors, board members demanding an emergency meeting. The bank underwriting the Vance Tower construction loan wanted to review the covenants in light of the new high-profile competition. The flawless, terrifying machine of Julian's life was beginning to sputter. The empire was shaking, and for the first time, Julian realized Arthur wasn't just trying to hurt him. He was trying to dismantle him, piece by piece, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own arrogant laughter. The war shifted from a series of volleys to a grinding siege. Arthur's strategy was masterful in its cruelty. He never engaged Julian directly. There were no threatening phone calls, no angry emails. There was only a silent, relentless, and public erosion of everything Julian had built. The first to defect was Julian's head of structural engineering, a genius named Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a man who cared more about legacy than bonuses. Arthur didn't just offer him more money, he offered him a chance to build the innovative, environmentally sound structures he'd always dreamed of, the very ideas Julian had dismissed as unprofitable nonsense. Finch's resignation was a quiet earthquake that sent tremors through the entire company. Next went the marketing team. Arthur, with Isabella as his public face, was winning the PR war without even fighting. Their project was the talk of the architectural world, lauded for its human-centric design. Vance Tower, once a symbol of ultimate luxury, was now being framed in the media as a monument to soulless greed. The multi-million-dollar penthouses were becoming harder to sell. Julian, trapped in a cycle of rage and reaction, became more tyrannical. He yelled at his staff, second-guessed every decision, and trusted no one. The atmosphere at Vance Global turned toxic. He doubled down on his legal assault against Isabella, but it backfired. His lawyers, following his aggressive orders, subpoenaed her obstetrician's records, a move so callous it was leaked to the press. The resulting headline, "Billionaire Demands Pregnant Wife's Medical Files," was a PR catastrophe. He felt like a man trying to catch smoke. He'd throw millions at a problem only for Arthur to outmaneuver him with a well-placed relationship or a perfectly timed announcement. Kobe, the investigator, was still hitting brick walls. "The money is clean, Julian," Kobe reported, sounding defeated. "After you ruined him, Arthur didn't go into business. He went into academia. He got a fellowship at Oxford. He spent 3 years studying economic theory and philosophy. He published a few papers on ethical capitalism. Obscure stuff. But during that time, he must have been networking, building his thesis." "A thesis for his revenge," Julian muttered. "Looks like it," Kobe agreed. "The funding for his new firm. It's not from Wall Street. It's old money. European families, Asian dynasties, people who were friends with his father, people who value long-term trust over quarterly reports. You built your empire on debt and leverage. He's built his on loyalty. Our usual tactics, they don't work on these people. You can't intimidate them." The bleeding was becoming literal. To shore up confidence in Vance Tower, Julian was forced to pour his own liquid capital into the project, buying back tranches of debt at a premium to appease the nervous banks. He had to sell a significant portion of his stock portfolio, including his cherished shares in blue-chip tech companies. He sold his private jet, justifying it as a cost-cutting measure, but everyone knew it was a sign of distress. One evening, desperate to feel some semblance of control, he drove himself out to Greenwich, Connecticut. He didn't go to the site of Arthur's project. He went to the address Kobe had given him for Arthur's residence. It was a large but understated stone house set back from the road behind a grove of old oak trees. He parked across the street, his engine off, and just watched. The lights were on, casting a warm, inviting glow. He saw shadows moving behind the windows. Then a light went on in an upstairs room, the one with a small balcony. Isabella stepped out onto the balcony. She was heavily pregnant now, her silhouette undeniable against the light. She wore a simple white shawl and was cradling a cup of what looked like tea. She wasn't crying. She wasn't wringing her hands. She was serene. She leaned against the railing, looking up at the stars. A moment later, Arthur joined her. He didn't touch her in a romantic way. Instead, he gently placed a thicker blanket over her shoulders and then pointed up at the sky, as if explaining a constellation. They stood there for a few moments in comfortable silence. It was a picture of quiet domesticity, of profound peace. A picture of everything Julian had never had and had never even known he wanted. The sight broke something in him. The rage, the fury, it was all still there, but it was now laced with a bitter, agonizing poison envy. He had stripped Arthur of his fortune, but Arthur had survived and built something new, something meaningful. In return, Arthur was stripping Julian not just of his money, but of his identity. Who was Julian Vance without the private jet, the unquestioned authority, the trophy wife? He was just a man alone in a car, watching a life he could never have. He started the car and drove away. The image of Isabella and Arthur under the stars burned into his mind. The bleeding wasn't just on his balance sheets anymore. It was internal. He was hemorrhaging a part of himself, and he had no idea how to stop it. The siege was working. The fortress of Julian Vance was beginning to crumble from the inside out. The descent accelerated. What began as a series of setbacks morphed into a full-blown crisis. A major construction supplier for Vance Tower, spooked by rumors of financial instability, demanded full payment up front for all future materials. The demand created a cascade of similar requests, triggering a liquidity crunch that sent shockwaves through the company. Julian was a cornered animal. The cool, calculating predator was gone, replaced by a desperate, snarling creature. He spent his days in his office, the blinds drawn, staring at financial data that painted a picture of inexorable decline. His nights were sleepless, fueled by scotch and paranoia. Marcus Thorne tried to be the voice of reason, urging a strategic retreat, perhaps a sale of the troubled Vance Tower project to cut their losses. "Sell!" Julian had roared, his face puce. "Sell my monument to some vulture capitalist? Never. This is my name on that building." "Julian, the name is becoming toxic," Marcus had argued, his loyalty finally strained to the breaking point. "We need to cauterize the wound before the infection spreads to the rest of Vance Global." The argument ended with Marcus tendering his resignation. It was the final betrayal in Julian's eyes, the last loyal soldier deserting the field. In reality, it was an act of self-preservation. Left alone, Julian's decisions became increasingly erratic. He channeled the last of his accessible funds into a reckless high-risk options trade, betting on a market fluctuation that his gut told him was coming. It was the kind of gamble a desperate man makes, and it blew up in his face. The market moved the wrong way. The loss was catastrophic, wiping out nearly a third of his remaining personal net worth in a single afternoon. He was bleeding out, and he knew it. He walked through his cavernous penthouse, a ghost in his own life. The Rothko on the wall seemed to mock him, its vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the gray despair of his reality. He remembered buying it with Isabella, who had explained its emotional depth, its layered meaning. He had only seen its escalating value. Now all he saw was an asset he had to liquidate. He called a private art dealer. The sale was discreet but humiliating. The painting he had once boasted about at dinner parties was crated up and taken away in the dead of night, sold for less than it was worth, because he needed the cash immediately. That night, hollowed out and shaking slightly, he did something he had sworn he would never do. He found Isabella's new private phone number, a feat that cost him an exorbitant sum paid to Kobe, and he called her. He didn't know what he would say. Apologize, threaten, plead. A man answered. It was Arthur. She won't be speaking with you, Julian. Arthur's voice was calm, devoid of triumph. It was the voice of a man, stating a simple, unalterable fact. Let me talk to her, Julian demanded, his voice cracking. She is my wife. A piece of paper you're trying to use as a weapon. Arthur countered smoothly. She is building a life, Julian. Something you never allowed her to do. She is preparing for the arrival of her child. The last thing she needs is the stress of your chaos. My chaos. You caused this. You plotted. You schemed. You turned her against me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Arthur spoke again, his voice was laced with a chilling sadness. You still don't see it, do you? I didn't turn her against you. Your actions did. Your cruelty, your neglect, your towering ego. I simply offered her a safe harbor when she finally decided to flee the storm. The storm was all of your own making. What do you want, Arthur? Julian whispered, his anger spent, leaving only a raw, gaping void. What is your endgame to see me bankrupt, homeless? My endgame, Arthur said softly, my endgame was achieved the moment Isabella found the strength to leave you. It was about her freedom, not your failure. But you, Julian, you are so blinded by the language of war and victory that you can't comprehend an act of simple human decency. You believe I did this to you. You can't imagine someone might have done it for her. He continued, she's happy, Julian. She is at peace. And the child will be born into a world of love and integrity. That is the end game. The rest of this, your financial troubles, the collapse of your tower, that's just the consequence of a life lived without a foundation. You built your empire on sand, and now the tide has come in. Arthur hung up. Julian stood in the silent penthouse, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. On sand. The words echoed in the empty room. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. The powerful Titan was gone. In his place was a haggard, defeated man, his expensive suit hanging on him like a costume. He made one last, desperate gambit. It wasn't financial, it was personal. He would see her. He would see them both. He would force a confrontation, a final reckoning in the real world, away from the battlefields of boardrooms and courtrooms. He called Arthur's office the next morning, his voice eerily calm. I'm conceding, he lied. There are things to discuss about the divorce, the child, face to face. No lawyers, you, me, and Isabella. Name the place and time. Arthur, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. A meeting was set for 2 days later at a neutral location, a private suite in a quiet, old-world hotel. Julian hung up the phone, a strange, cold resolve settling over him. If he was going down, he would not go down quietly. He would look his destroyers in the eye and make them see the ruin they had wrought. The hotel suite was a masterpiece of luxurious neutrality. It was designed to be impressive, yet forgettable. A transient space for deals to be signed and secrets kept. The furniture was expensive but devoid of personality. The art on the walls was tasteful but unchallenging, and the thick, cream-colored carpet absorbed all sound, creating a heavy, expectant silence. For Julian, it felt less like a neutral ground and more like a softly furnished courtroom, a final, quiet chamber where his life sentence was about to be read. He arrived a full 30 minutes early, the habit of a commander, securing the battlefield. Yet the familiar surge of power that punctuality usually gave him was absent. In its place was a gnawing unease, a frantic energy that had him pacing from the window to the door and back again. His Tom Ford suit, usually a second skin of authority, felt stiff and foreign, a costume for a role he could no longer play. He caught his reflection in the polished surface of a mahogany side table, a haggard man with haunted eyes, and quickly looked away. He ran through his strategies, the mental scripts he'd prepared. He would start with controlled indignation, outlining Arthur's treachery. He would then pivot to magnanimity, a calculated offer regarding the child's welfare, designed to expose Arthur's motives as purely financial. He would be the rational one, the wronged party willing to rise above the sordid affair for the sake of his heir. He rehearsed the lines in his head, but the words felt hollow, like counterfeit currency. The titan of industry was a ghost, and this desperate man pacing the room was all that was left. The click of the door latch was a sound as final as a gavel. Julian froze mid-pace, turning to face the entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs. Arthur Penhaligon entered first. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who possesses a power far deeper than wealth, the power of self-possession. His silver hair seemed to gather the soft light of the room, and his eyes, when they met Julian's, held no trace of triumph, no hint of a gloating victor. They held a calm, profound clarity, the gaze of a man who had seen the bottom and was no longer afraid of depths. Then Isabella moved past him into the room, and the air left Julian's lungs. The sight was a physical blow. It wasn't just that she was heavily pregnant, her body transformed by the new life within her. It was the absolute, unshakable serenity that radiated from her. The woman who had fled his penthouse was a study in fear and desperate courage. This woman was a portrait of peace. She wore a simple navy blue dress that did nothing to hide her form. In fact, it celebrated it. Her hand rested on the swell of her belly, not as a protective shield, but as a gesture of quiet communion, a gentle cradle. She looked at him, and her expression shattered his last vestiges of composure. He had braced himself for anger, for resentment, even for fear. He was prepared to fight those emotions. But what he saw in her eyes was a quiet, devastating pity. It was the look one gives to a man who is screaming and railing inside a soundproof room, unaware that no one can hear him. It disarmed him completely. In her gaze, he wasn't a monster or an enemy. He was simply irrelevant. Julian, Arthur said, his voice as calm and even as the surface of a deep lake. He gestured to a set of plush armchairs arranged around a low-glass table. Thank you for agreeing to meet. The practiced speeches, the calculated stratagems, they all turned to ash in Julian's mouth. All that was left was the raw, primal wound. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Arthur. He snapped, the sound of his own voice, thin and brittle, in the silent room. You've won. You can drop the benevolent act. He swept a trembling hand towards Isabella. You've taken everything. My company is bleeding out. My reputation is destroyed. You've taken my wife, my child. His voice cracked on the last word, a humiliating fissure in his armor. Are you happy now? Is this the grand revenge you fantasized about all those years living on scraps? Isabella, who had been lowering herself carefully into one of the chairs, was the one who answered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through his rage with surgical precision. This was never about revenge, Julian, she said softly. This was about rescue. Rescue. He let out a laugh, but it was a ragged, ugly sound. Rescue from what? A penthouse overlooking the park. A life where you wanted for nothing. I gave you a world that queens would envy. You gave me a cage, she corrected him, her gaze unwavering. A beautiful gilded cage where the bars were made of your expectations. You didn't want a wife, you wanted a masterpiece for your collection. Do you remember when I wanted to help fund that small art therapy program for children in the Bronx? I was so passionate about it. You called it a charming but meaningless distraction and wrote a check to the Met instead, telling me to chair a gala because it had better press opportunities. You didn't just dismiss my idea, Julian. You dismissed me. He flinched, the memory a distant one for him, but clearly a cornerstone of her experience. He had no answer for it, so he did what he always did. He turned on the bigger threat. He fixed his glare on Arthur. A friend, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You saw an opening and you took it. A lonely, vulnerable woman married to your greatest enemy. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was some noble act of charity. Arthur met his furious gaze. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely on his knees, assuming the posture of a teacher, a mentor. When you engineered my ruin, he began, his voice low and contemplative. I lost my fortune. I lost my standing. And for a long time, I walked through the world feeling like a ghost. I believed you had taken everything. But in the silence that followed after the lawyers and creditors were gone, I began to realize that you had only taken the things that could be counted. The things that truly matter: your mind, your principles, the love of your family, the respect of true friends. Those things are beyond any man's power to take. You can only give them away. He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. I spent 3 years at Oxford, not studying finance, but philosophy. I learned about value that isn't listed on a stock exchange. I met Isabella at that fundraiser you dismissed. You were across the room, Julian, bathed in spotlights, shaking hands with a senator. You were the sun, and everyone was expected to be a planet in your orbit. I saw her standing alone in the shadows, looking at a child's messy, brilliant finger painting with more genuine awe than you ever showed for the Rothko in your living room. So I spoke to her, Arthur continued. I asked her what she saw in the painting, and she told me. She spoke of hope, of uninhibited expression, of a world not yet constrained by price tags and prestige. We talked for an hour. You never even noticed she was gone. My friendship with her began that night, and it had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with the intelligent, passionate, wonderful woman whose light you were systematically suffocating. Julian felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor was tilting beneath his feet. You deny that you plotted this, he whispered, clinging to his narrative of betrayal. I deny that my primary motive was your destruction, Arthur clarified, his voice sharpening with precision. My motive was the construction of something good, a business built on ethical principles, a community built on connection, a safe harbor for a woman I had come to care for as a dear friend. I wanted to build something that would last. Your self-destruction, Julian, is merely the inevitable consequence of your own character. It was always going to happen. You built your entire life, your entire empire, on a foundation of sand, of leverage, of intimidation, of fear. And now, the tide has come in. On sand. The two words detonated in the center of Julian's mind, and the entire structure of his reality collapsed. In that blinding, horrifying moment of clarity, he saw it all. He saw his betrayal of Arthur not as a masterstroke, but as the first act of a man terrified of being second best. He saw his marriage to Isabella not as a union, but as an acquisition. He saw his relentless pursuit of wealth not as ambition, but as a desperate attempt to fill a bottomless void within himself. Vance Tower, his monument, was nothing but a tombstone for his soul. He looked at Isabella, and the veil was finally irrevocably torn away. He didn't see the woman who had defied him. He saw the woman he had courted, the woman whose laughter he had loved before he decided it was an unproductive sound. He saw the mother of his child, a child who would grow up learning of integrity from Arthur Penhaligon, a child who would hear the story of Julian Vance as a cautionary tale. The scale of his loss was absolute. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the power, it was the future. It was the possibility of warmth on a cold night. It was the sound of genuine laughter in his own home. It was the chance to be a father. He had traded it all for a penthouse view of a city that now felt alien, and for the hollow echo of his own name. A single dry sob tore itself from his throat. It was not a sound of grief. It was the sound of a structure collapsing, of a man's entire worldview being ground into dust. He had no more words. The venom was gone. The anger was spent. The accusations were meaningless. There was nothing left. Without looking at either of them again, he turned. His movements were stiff, robotic. He walked toward the door, a ghost leaving his own haunting. As his hand touched the cool brass of the doorknob, he heard Arthur's voice, not directed at him, but at Isabella. It was gentle, quiet, and filled with a profound and simple care. "Are you all right?" The question wasn't for him. He no longer factored into the equation of their well-being. In the space of that one question, he was relegated to the past, a closed chapter. The world, their world, had already moved on, and he was still in the room. That was the final verdict. He pulled the door open and walked out, not bothering to close it behind him. He moved through the hushed elegance of the hotel lobby and out onto the bustling city street, a wraith amidst the living. He was a man who had laughed as his wife left him, certain of his power, only to discover in the final terrible silence that he hadn't lost an argument. He had lost everything that mattered. And so Julian Vance was left alone in his glass tower, a king of a shrinking kingdom, haunted by the ghost of a laugh. His story is a powerful reminder that a life built on arrogance and greed is a fortress built on sand, ready to be washed away by the tides of consequence. He thought he was losing a wife, but he was actually losing his soul. What do you think? Was this karma? Was it a meticulously planned revenge? Or was it truly an act of rescue? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story of ambition, betrayal, and ultimate justice captivated you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story with a powerful twist. And for more gripping tales of drama and consequence, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Thank you for listening.